So, welcome to the VR Open Roundtable. Now, this is going to be a bit of an experiment, and the reason for that is, well, I was asked to do this at the last minute because the other person who originally planned to do this wasn't able to make it to the conference, and he had good reasons. So, I won't publicly shame him. But the reason I agreed to it was I think who here has been to GDC in the last 3 years? What has been the prevailing theme of what everyone's excited about at GDC for the last 3 years? Huh? Well, VR. I would argue VR. Back three, not this GDC, but the last GDC. I had the chance to experience Eve Valkyrie on one of the very early Rift development kits, and it became apparent to me at that point that eventually, almost all of us in this room are going to have our worlds touched in some way by VR. And as you may have noticed, this is the only VR-centered talk happening at the Kirk Summit this year. So it was important for me to do this. Now, who am I, and why am I talking to you all? My name is Kirk Rodgers. I'm a user researcher at Google, but I'm not speaking based on my experiences at Google. I wrote an article last year that focused on my questions, my open questions about what was different about VR for user research as opposed to other kinds of user research. Now, for an open roundtable, I request and encourage participation from the audience, but just so there's not awkward silence the entire time, we also have our resident expert, Travis Bowles. And he's a senior design researcher at Xbox, and he is one of the few people that can admit that he's working on VR, and is willing to talk about it to some degree. So just be aware of the occasional Fifth Amendment responses. So I'm just going to jump into the things that I think are open questions that we need to figure out how we're going to address. Has anyone here played the Kinect back in the day? So one of the things that I noticed with the Kinect is that if you went to a Kinect to one of the Microsoft stores and saw people playing with the Kinect, there was this big wow factor. In fact, in my opinion, it often overshadowed the quality of the games themselves that were on display. And if you look at the life cycle of the Kinect afterwards, one could argue that once that wow factor faded, I'm sorry, Travis.
I think you can argue that.
Yeah, it became less emphasized, and the quality of the games that were available became what was important for it, and for these kinds of things, they succeed or fail in the strength of the games. So my question that I have is, in assessing new games on something like this, and we know there's the wow factors. There's the jokes about Oculus mouth. Has anyone seen everyone going like as they're goggled in? There's definitely that wow factor. I felt it. Almost everyone I know that's engaged with VR has felt it. And how do we filter that out from the actual quality of the games we're testing? So I'm going to open it up to Travis first, and then we can have additional comments and discussion on this particular problem.
All right. Hi, I'm Travis. I recognize some people and many others I do not. So a couple of things just to give you background on where I'm coming from. First, I'd done work with HoloLens on the AR side, a lot of ethnography and in-home type research to understand how HoloLens might fit into people's lives, opportunities, blockers for AR, and understanding that sort of technology. I could talk a little bit more about that than I can some of the other things. The other big thing I'm working on now is I'm lead research for user research on Minecraft, and Minecraft has announced that they're doing an Oculus Rift version of Minecraft as well as a Gear VR version, and so I've been doing research on that. So if you see me go quiet when you ask me a question, I'm just doing mental gymnastics about what I'm allowed to talk about and what I'm not. In answering the wow factor as a confound, I think this is interesting. Certainly, I agree. It's an amazing experience, and when someone gets into and steps into a world like Minecraft or something for the first time, it really is a jaw-dropping moment. And they'll talk about how jaw-dropping and how impressive and how amazing and immersive it is. But unlike Connect, I think everyone has always kind of wanted this. It's coming in a way in your head. You've all imagined being more immersed in your games. Connect answered a problem that no one was really asking anybody to solve. It was cool, it was unique, and the experiences that were built for it kind of came out of looking at the technology and what can the technology let us do that's new. Whereas with VR, if I went around this room, everybody in here could probably think of one or two VR type experiences that they've either thought of since seeing the technology existed, or more likely, maybe watching The Matrix or any of a million of other imaginations of what it would be like to have a virtual world you can immerse yourself in. And because of that, I think people are amazed by the experience. It's kind of like falling in love. Everybody kind of expects in their lifetime they're going to fall in love. So they have a model for what that's like, but when they experience it, wow, right? It's much, much more of a punch in the gut than what they thought. That said, once they've experienced it, they start to move on to a little bit more rapidly to more practical concerns, considerations, and maybe even disappointments when it comes to things like, well, now is the game actually fun? How much time can I spend in this experience? What's actually easier in this experience versus just sitting in front of my computer with a keyboard and mouse? Has anybody here seen the Community episode on VR? Show of hands? Yeah, if you haven't, I can recommend watching it. It's a very interesting take on the promise versus the peril of using the new and cool and unique interactions that VR affords to try to solve common problems that we've actually solved pretty well with other types of interface devices like the keyboard and mouse.
Oh yeah, we have another. I'm gonna run up to you and bring you the mic. So one moment.
Well, they can't hear on there. We're gonna do it Donahue style because they can't hear on that camera over there.
That'd be great. Thank you. Yeah.
I could probably have chosen someone more recognizable than Donahue at this point, but sorry. That's not funny.
So I just actually wanted to get clarity on the question. So the question that kicked us off is, how do we deal with the wow confound to tell if a virtual reality game is higher quality, a better experience, yada, 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 versus a different VR game? Is that right? Is that the question you're asking?
Or versus other games in general. I would argue
Okay.
that
So VR
that,
versus
that we might, like if all you have to compare against is fun scores for like console games,
right.
And you get just for example, you get a fun score that's like through the roof for your new VR game, and you're like super excited.
Sure, but it's likely a cause due to the novelty.
Right, exactly. But the question that I have that I feel like we need to figure, we need to at least be discussing is how do we how do we filter that out,
Sure.
and make sure we're not accounting, like what is the game quality that we're accounting for, and what is just the awesomeness of VR?
So is it a stupid thing to say? Because I've said stupid things in the past, and this may be a stupid thing I'm about to say. But is it just that you actually can't control for that until people have more experience with multiple VR games? I mean, that's how we're getting people to do their fun assessments with the other gaming platforms, right?
I think that will be part of it. I think that certainly happens with Connect, and you start to be able to make comparisons. I think practically speaking, there are so many elements of the VR experience that are apparently more or less challenging when you're in it versus what you're used to, that I think even within a session, you can map out to some degree those changes. I don't want to get too specific there, but essentially that would be my take on it. Is that it's not as hard, I think, to make those comparisons. You're going to be making them, so if you have a game, for instance, like Minecraft that has the variety of versions, let's put aside VR for a moment and look at the novelty of taking those into other platforms. Dedicated players and players who enjoy that experience get right back down to the Minecraftness of the experience pretty quick. And I think that you can do that with certain kinds of experiences. And if you have genre leaders, if you're not talking about a genre that exists only because of the technology, and that's a whole separate question, then you are talking about something where there are people do have comparisons. They can get to those comparisons. They do eventually pick their job off the floor. It's kind of that analogy for me before. There's a honeymoon period, but I'm not convinced it's as long as what we might initially think.
So can you tell us, in your experience, how long the honeymoon period has been?
So anyway, what I can say is, let's go back to Connect for a second and talk about Connect and the way that people approach their interactions with Connect, because I think it's a good metaphor and one that I feel a little more comfortable talking about. When you think about the things that were exciting and transformational and fun about a game, like say a game like Dance Central, you still now have the same issues you had to concern yourself with before about menu out navigation, and a whole host of additional problems come with the technology in doing those things. And so you actually can ramp up other elements of the experience that might make things less fun just by the nature of the technology itself. So there is a jaw-dropping moment, but there's also an opportunity with new technologies like this and experiences to find yourself facing more intense problems that can actually contribute to getting a more balanced evaluation than what you might expect. That said, things like fun scores and stuff might now not be able to be as easily calibrated, but when you look at everything as a whole and you talk to your participants and you try to ingest your playtest data as a whole, it's less challenging to find your way to knowing what's good and not than what it might seem initially.
So, kind of the obvious solution to me to solve that problem is to do it at the recruiting level, where you recruit people that already have that experience. That's obviously going to be challenging now. Before it's, you really have to be an enthusiast to have already experienced it. But PlayStation VR just announced a launch date, so that's going to make it a lot easier. The other way that I would do it, I've solved similar problems, is by baselining people yourself, right? So bring them in, show them an experience that isn't quite what you want to get feedback on, but kind of clears that wow factor out of the way. And then you show them your second thing that's your actual test.
So a palate cleanser.
Yeah, basically.
Awesome.
I think this gentleman in the middle was first.
Who?
Right here in brown. Yes.
Just to add on James's thing, I think selection around people who have VR experiences is actually probably going to add more of a confound in the short term, because you have early adopters coming in. I think with the palate cleanser thing, beyond palate cleansing, the way we've done it in other kinds of contexts is you don't just get to baseline, you like monotonize it. So you really kill down the experience by doing multiple exposures to a different kind of use of that tech before dumping them into the new thing, because you're still going to expect some spiking up as a result of that. Similar to like a filter in more classic cognitive stuff.
Thanks.
This makes me think of a sort of jaw-dropping product that I tested in the 90s for Sega, we called it the Activator, but it was which nobody knows of, but it was like a circle of a hexagonal thing around.
Sorry, speaking to the mic.
Oh, sorry, yes. It was a hexagonal thing around you with panels sending up infrared beams, and you could swing a bat or punch, and you could use this to control your video game. And it seemed really cool to me, and I convinced the company to do it. So I thought I was in solid ground when we had people play test it for like over a 10-day period or something. And people were just raving about it even after the 10 days. And the product failed. And I think just listening to this conversation here, what I'm thinking is you got to have people play the thing for a fair while. And I don't know how long that is, and maybe it's weeks, maybe it's a month. And if I would think the jaw-dropping thing would wear off, and if they've played this game, an hour a day for a month, and they're still ecstatic about it, then maybe you're on solid ground. And if not, if you're starting to see this big fall off, that's not quite so different anymore, then you kind of know.
So first of all, I remember the Activator.
Oh.
And if you want to see some great YouTube videos, there's a great YouTube video of them demonstrating the Activator on QVC, which is definitely worth the price of admission. So go look it up. It's
I'll
very
check
very
that
good.
out happily.
It's pretty good.
All right.
That's an interesting point. I don't fully agree that you need to have that level of that length of time. I get the point. I take the point completely. And as people who work on a platform level, for an Xbox and having had the Kinect experience, certainly wary of that. honeymoon period wearing off to the point where you have a divorce. But I would argue that it's still beneficial to understand in that short term, especially for experiences that might bring people to a new platform, to understand that experience, maybe it's only getting them past that period of time. Maybe it's the thing that introduces those mechanisms, those mechanics, normalizes the interaction. And having experiences like that are still valuable. And when we're as early as we are, it's also true that you need to have experiences that are compellingly demoable to someone else that you know, right? Things that people can get into and understand. We talked about, you look at people in their homes trying to take these new technologies and explain them to someone else. The first thing that they try to do to justify VR, you go out and buy a $600 device and a $1,500 computer to run it. You want to show people why that's awesome, and having some experiences that even have that compelling short burst of bringing someone up to speed on what the potential is. We're still in that point a little bit. We saw that with like the mobile games. Remember back in the early days of the App Store for iOS, how many variations were there on the rolling ball to get people accustomed to the cool things you could do with a combination of haptics, graphics, and tilt. And we'll probably have a phase of time where people will be doing that as well. Did you want to say? And so, yeah, so I think that's something as well it's part of that.
So any other thoughts or comments on this particular topic before we move on to the next burning question in VR? All right, I think we're good. So PlayStation actually has a solution for this that sounds really interesting. But one of the things that concerned me when I was thinking about, okay, I'm used to closely observing what user research subjects are doing and being able to see what they see. It helps me with my own empathy, as we saw in the last talk. Like helps me with my own empathy in terms of being able to see what they're doing, the way they're doing it, and being able to replicate that at will. When you go into like 3D space with virtual reality, or even worse, AR. You end up with a situation where it's very difficult to have a direct one-to-one experience of what the user is doing. Like if you can't put on a headset, because then you'll have to like throw down like half a dozen Dramamine to keep yourself from getting sick if you just play back what someone else is doing with their head movement. We see an example up here of like the double fisheye that we've seen with Oculus over the last couple of years. I know that PlayStation has a breakout box. I think Maddie mentioned that. Yeah, and that sort of pulls it together into a coherent, more coherent scene. But that still doesn't quite get at what it really looks like in 3D space in front of the person. So the question that I have is how do we get past this and be able to assume the point of view of our user and be able to see what they see in a way that's not distorted by 1 second.
Just to loop on that, why is that important? Like, we already don't get that when we're observing a player now. Like, the actual experience they're getting isn't just the visual stimulus hitting their eyes. It's whatever's going on inside their heads, and then we're trying to extract to figure out what the actual subjective experience is. Is it important to have the visual stimulus like fit, or do we need to figure out how to better get at what's happening in there when they're engaging?
I think that's a really good question. I think that it's harder for me. It's harder for me as a researcher to parse what's even going on in a situation like that, and that's just one more barrier between me and what the user is experiencing. Yes, of course, like looking at a playback of what somebody's doing with a video of their face while they're playing, it's an approximation at best. But this is a further layer of abstraction, and I want to think about how we get past that. Any thoughts?
Yeah. I'm Florian from Ubisoft. So I want to share two things we have done about exactly this problem. So first thing, something we have actually tested is to add one user researcher for a multiplayer game into the group of players to have a better view of what the players were experiencing. And it was really interesting, really successful, but you can't do that every time. The other things we have done, and it's more related to what was just evoked, you can do some think-aloud protocols with VR2, and so the players can explain what he is experiencing as he is playing. And I really recommend this methodology with VR. We had question about was it possible to already do think-aloud with a player that is really immersed, and it is really what we are doing. We are actually talking directly to the players through headphone with a microphone. It works really well.
So I would, we've had to deal with this on a very, I'll sort of for just very practical, low level. Not all the devices out there, especially the untethered, maybe lower power devices, can broadcast while simultaneously maintaining frame rate. So in a very practical sense, in some cases you have, you're giving a different experience to the user merely by observing, which can practically influence the actual test that you're doing. When you step beyond that and think about this, looking at these, someone will come up with a pithy way to talk about the double fisheye or something. I don't have that. But whatever term that people use for looking at that, I happen to be a person who can get motion sick watching a regular user play a regular FPS over their shoulder. So this is interesting. But the way I deal with this, and I think it's not too dissimilar from the way we deal with a lot of other game experiences, maybe even the sense that we don't have a touch screen in our hand and we're not actually pressing the buttons like our users are, is I am really familiar with the thing I'm testing. And I've spent a lot of time immersed in it to the point where when I even hear someone talking about it, I can start to put myself in that situation. I know what that feels like. I know what that experience is like. I know what it feels like to be able to feel like I can reach out and touch the block over there. I get it. And so it's not to say that it's not important to have a good representation. It is. But I can translate that fairly well back into their experience to the point of where I can make estimations on where things are in their field of view, what might be more challenging to tend to, what they're likely to start, maybe turning towards to try to get, because it's something you do with VR. You want to see an element on the menu on a HUD, and you might try to move your head to it. You start to get a feel for that, just like you do with any other UI. And I think a lot of that is just making sure you've immersed yourself in it to the point where you can essentially know that and translate what they're seeing and what they're talking about. And Think Aloud's great. I mean, Think Aloud continues to work for a lot of things, doesn't it? And it's a way to also help translate those things. And it's admittedly the methods involved in that at a very low level of getting someone simultaneously comfortable with the artificiality of the lab already, and then putting them into a virtual world, and then tacking that on and continuing to have a conversation with them during the process. It's very interesting, and certainly you have to make some adjustments there. But I do think you can use those visualizations to do it.
Hi. So actually, along those lines of Think Aloud protocol, I've got some concerns about how we're going to balance the cognitive workload of putting somebody in VR and then talking to you about that experience. And the whole thing with VR is it's supposed to be immersive. But then if you ask them to talk to you, you're asking them to jump into the world and jump out of the world and jump into the world and jump out of the world. And I've got some concerns about how that's going to affect the validity of our tests and the conclusions that we draw, and whether or not we alter the experience by testing it alone. So
let me give you the unsatisfying answer that I initially had for that, which is, if you ask anybody who works on Halo 5, it's supposed to be really immersive too. And so the idea is that we already encountered that to a certain degree when we talk about compelling game experiences. And I think I know people love to talk about flow, things of that nature, that way we express the ability to really be immersed. So we still have that problem a little with Think Aloud, and we encountered that was the same question, I think, that we were asking ourselves, 15 years ago when we're starting to do this kind of stuff. It is more severe in this instance. It does mean, for instance, you might be talking to someone and they might be, let's imagine a Call of Duty, virtual reality Call of Duty, and maybe it's hard to talk to them when they get into the parts where there's more shelling going on and so forth. But if you're testing an RTS and they're getting a lot of information about what's happening outside their field of view at different times, you're going to have a similar level of challenge. And some of our games have a lot more basically they put a lot more cognitive load on folks in other games and at different times. And so what it does mean is when you go back to that immersion and really knowing where people are and understanding it, you have to be constantly on the lookout for those situations which might not on their face. It might not be that it's a lot of noise, or maybe it's not that it's a lot of motion, but you know that that's a challenging thing to process. So for instance, maybe one of the things that people might experience is even with the relatively low fidelity that you'll see in some games, the way that they render their worlds relative to our world, and with the state of technology being where it is, walking down a cliff or going underwater or encountering a giant spider, if it happens to be in a game, even if it's not a realistic looking spider, it's something that still has a different reaction for people. So being aware of those things so that you can sort of react the way we already, I think, instinctively do for difficult passages in our games works. That said, there are still interesting questions about whether or not that immersive piece is so core to the fun. That's why you essentially have to mix it up with play tests and put people in a situation where they really are in control of it, and you have to let them have that kind of experience as well.
So the next one I want to talk about is, this is one we've already touched on a little bit, but we don't know for sure who's going to end up buying these things. Who's going to be the, like, is it going to be a product with mass market appeal that everyone's going to buy one? There's going to be one in every living room? Probably not at first. But in the end, like, will it be enthusiasts that have the money to, like, only enthusiasts that have the money to spend, like, what, $4,000 on an Oculus ready computer and another $600 on an Oculus? In the end, the question that I'm struggling with is who, like, not next year, but in 5 years, 10 years, who will our users be? Who do we need to be thinking about in the long run, in terms of how we're designing not just experiences for now, which obviously we should be designing for the enthusiasts now, but in the long run, if this market wants to build past that, how are we even gonna know who these people are?
I'm going to ask a series of questions to the audience because I love making people give back. So first of all, who thinks that their first long term, let's say playing a game let's say playing a game for a couple of weeks, who thinks their first long term exposure will be on a device they own? Okay. Who thinks it'll be on a device that a friend owns? Okay. Who thinks it'll be on a device that their work owns? Yeah, right. So this is a challenge we encounter to a lesser degree even in the purchasing of games and maintaining high-end gaming systems and keeping up with the curve of technology. In this particular space, it's a lot more challenging. The idea of dropping, it's I think about $1,600 to make I think it's what they say, an Oculus Rift ready computer, and then the Oculus Rift. I don't actually know for Vive. The decision to go that route versus going with Gear VR, which is an add-on to your phone. It's a different kind of device. It's maybe a different kind of experience. That's something that people are going to make in a very different way than we might make in this room. Also, who plays video games and their partner doesn't play video games? Let me ask it that way. The person they spend the most time around, let's say, in their home, roommate, partner. Okay, fair mix of folks. Do they talk to you sometimes when you're playing video games? Who, raise your hand if they know they can talk to you or maybe bring you food or maybe show you something on your phone, right? I see some nodding, not a lot of hands, but that's okay. Again, one person in the house throws on the VR, excited, laughing, enjoying themselves, and the other person sits here and just kind of looks over there. Looks like you're having a lot of fun. Wish I could have some fun. That's a different kind of challenge of adoption than what we see with some other technologies. When you talk about the 5-year course, that's going to be a big part of it too. Is going to be convincing. There's a sort of a joke about the notion that you sell these things in pairs, right? So that you make sure that everybody in the household can experience experiences together. But then we talk about deeply immersive experiences, and the first place people go a lot of times is to deeply personal, individualized experiences. So even if you have multiple people in the same home sharing a device, you don't necessarily get that interaction, and you get, again, even a more extreme version of the alone together kind of interactions that you see with other technology. When you think of something like augmented reality, that's one of the nice things about augmented reality is the potential exists to share that world and share that experience and not give up every cue of engagement that you would give up with VR potentially. Of course, the challenge there still is to fully experience it and fully enjoy it. Both people really need to be, or more than two people need to be engaged with it that same way. I think viral adoption, again, it comes down to demoing. It comes down to people really getting that sense of it. And if when someone's demoing, you can't see what they're doing, you can't explain it to them and describe it to them, you can't share the experience with them, well, maybe they put that device down and you go watch television together. So yeah, I think there are some interesting challenges just around the social dynamics and the in-home side of things, not to mention on the early adopter side. And when we think about the differences between the different classes of VR devices that are out there and soon to be AR devices, you think about if you have a whole bunch of people out there who essentially classify themselves as early adopters, and their exposure is mostly through the high-end devices that have different capabilities than the people who have these other devices that have a somewhat more limited, but actually in some ways they're untethered, so they have other strengths. You have multiple paths that are essentially all VR. The distinction between AR and VR gets a little blurred as those devices start to converge somewhat in features. You have Vive giving you some information about your environment to keep you from running into a wall, but I don't believe they have information to keep you from stepping on your cat. But so it's just things that are static in the environment they can see. When those things start to converge, you have a whole bunch of things that fall under that classification in the same way we talk about gaming now. We say mobile, but mobile means a lot of things. We say console. Console generally means just about one thing. And then we have PC, and we talk about all of these things as a spectrum. It's not unreasonable to think about these experiences as getting divided out that way. And early adopters, the devices they choose may very well not be the same devices that most people actually get long-term exposure on.
Oh, James.
So regarding the who are the end users, I'm actually, and this may be sacrilegious, I'm not actually sure that gaming is going to make up a whole lot of even like the 2 to 3 year group. Like early on, yeah, like I'm super excited for gaming. But I think just like virtual tourism and stuff like that, like productivity apps is going to be much bigger and a way that a lot more people are going to interact with VR in general. I managed to convince my wife to buy a Samsung phone so that I could get Gear VR. And every time I show that off, I don't show them, one of the games I got. I show them like an experience where you're underwater and there's sharks swinging around. And that is way more compelling for the average person, in my very limited experience, than trying to sit down and immediately start playing a game.
So I think one of the things that we, at Studios User Research, one of the things we tend to think about is interactive entertainment all up, and that could be different levels. So some of it, just like what you're describing, could also be considered some interactive entertainment, the ability to move around in those spaces, still the stuff that we're interested in. But I would say one of the things that games will do, I believe, and what they've done in the past for other technologies is, let's go back to the classic example of, and it's not self-serving, solitaire. And Solitaire's introduction with Windows as a way to help introduce people to the concepts of the mouse and to get them used to using those kinds of interactions, windowing way to their applications when their boss came up. Incidentally, that was one thing they could learn. But also learning how to use a mouse in a compelling way. And we talk about all of the potential control schemes and all the potential ways you can interact with VR. I think games are likely to be the gateway that gets people past that initial hump of learning those and understanding how they can be integrated into complex experiences. So as people who work in games, I think part of our responsibility will be defining some of those interactions and teaching those interactions.
Personally, I think when you look at VR, let's say in 5 years, it's more readily available to the audience. In my honest opinion, I think it's probably going to mostly be used for people to watch things like Netflix. Because if you look at the internet traffic nowadays, it's mostly generated by Netflix, and I feel like even with like the non-gaming crowd, that's what's gonna draw them to that. But then there is that issue of it's a single-person experience.
I think there are a couple of companies out there that have shown or demoed or maybe just talked about on the couch viewing experiences where multiple people have VR devices on their heads and I guess can see very uncanny valley versions of the person next to them watching TV, or they could take the headsets off and watch TV together. But I I definitely think that's a potential. And there's also, I can't remember if it was Boeing. One of the airlines has looked into, one of the airline manufacturers, the plane manufacturers, has looked into providing VR at each seat to essentially create the illusion of being in an open environment and to help you to deal with the notion of being trapped in a small space. You put the VR in, now suddenly I'm out in a meadow and I can, reach out and smack any number of things around me. Which isn't maybe the best thing, but so there are some things there that I think that fit that kind of notion of just taking advantage of creating a virtual world around you. I certainly think that this is one of the cool things about technology like this. We've seen this with when you embedded all these sensors on phones, when you embed a certain amount of computing technology in a small device, people always start doing amazing things with it that you just wouldn't think. Like I parked my car out here today. I thought, well, maybe they'll ask me for my license plate at the to register as a visitor, so I take a picture of it. Well, I guarantee you that when someone put a camera on a phone, they didn't think that was the way people would use it. They probably thought they were going to use it for much more useful, interesting things. But essentially, I think VR is going to hit that point too. And I think games is one, and we think about games and all of them, we sort of map flat things into 3D things. But the notion of what a game is going to be and what kind of social interactions this could facilitate, I think we're just going to put it out in the hands of a bunch of smart folks that we'll all probably have to deliver test results to at some point. And they're going to come up with some pretty cool ideas.
Yeah, I had a quick reply to that as well. I think I agree with a lot of people that the entry into the market will probably be Netflix and productivity and maybe like IMAX style movies, in the comfort of your home. But then, like you mentioned, Minecraft, perfect example, doesn't need a lot of computing power. So I think games has a great opportunity there to just get in with all those people with something simple and fun, and then just blowing up from there. Yeah, definitely. And I think Oculus, just because it's tethered, is losing the battle already to untethered.
So this is an interesting one. Tethered versus untethered is very interesting. The amount of how compelling and immersive the experience can be right now, and the limitations that exist in an untethered system. I'm speaking strictly for VR here. I'm not talking about AR. I mean, the HoloLens is an untethered system, obviously, and very compelling experience. But when you have something directly to compare against, and that would be things like the tethered experiences. Even Vive, you can get up and move around your room as long as you don't, trip over your cable or run out of cable. If you have people sitting in chairs and interacting with these things, yes, you can certainly get yourself. You have only so many times you can rotate one direction and so forth. But it's actually for the same reasons we're talking about these strengths of interaction. In the same ways you can forget for a moment that you have something on your head, you can forget for a moment that you're a little bit restricted in your motion in the world. And so I'm not as down on tethered experiences, although it is interesting when you start out with a limitation like that, conceptually what feels like a very limiting thing, for a technology that's built on this idea of creating an unlimited world. But my experience and my take on that is it's actually not such a limiting thing, and the boost you get in capability right now is a good trade-off.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the idea of the separation of the player from the audience in this case. And I think it's actually parallel to the issue of visualizing what the player is seeing, what the participant is seeing while you're doing a UX testing. That would be an interesting thing to tackle. And I'm also wondering about when you're sitting in a living room with a bunch of friends who are watching you play a game, and for example it's not their turn or something, but you're still having a reaction from them. So what role does that play in also you encouraging you to continue playing and affecting you?
So I think that's a very interesting point. I think when you talk about socializing these things, that becomes an interesting challenge. The Minecraft team has demoed the ability to play across individuals. So basically, we could have a room full of people potentially playing on, I believe it's across Pocket and Windows 10. you could be playing on those in the same world as I'm on VR. And so now I can be in that world experiencing it. Now I'm not getting the same experience you are. I'm not getting that compelling VR experience. But what I am doing is maybe helping you work on something, and maybe we feel like we trade off who gets to use VR. Maybe if we're building something together, I'm going to do the things that take best advantage of using VR, while you're going to do the things that take best advantage of using those other capabilities. And we can still sort of enjoy these things together. We can chat it, through the game, or we can chat to each other directly. And the flip side of that, which is kind of cool, is that, and I was joking earlier about sitting on your couch together on VR, but the difference between sitting on your couch together in VR and sitting 1,000 miles away together in VR is now that gap closes more than relative to other technologies, and that can be very cool. So you can bring that same concept of looking over someone's shoulder at the at an arcade machine or at home in the living room. You can bring that now to them from farther away, and the experience won't be any different for VR necessarily than if you were in the same room together. So it actually could, I think, in some ways, with smart design, could actually be better in that regard.
Dom?
Yeah, you mentioned something earlier that brought up something interesting around the end users. You mentioned that you viewed VR and AR as a spectrum, but it seems like VR currently doesn't have much of an affordance for new interaction patterns. It's mostly just blast the interaction pattern like harder at you, whereas AR actually lets you do kinds of things that you couldn't do in the world before. Will how people use those really decide what our end users are? Because with VR, I think the promise right now is the enthusiast promise. With AR, you have some pretty different things you can do.
Yeah, Bill Gates just did an AMA. Again, I feel like a Microsoft stooge when I say that, but he did a cool AMA, and he was asked about AR versus VR, and he talked about VR in terms of a specialized case of AR, and that when he talked about the spectrum, he's like, if you can conquer AR, you can take VR and you can do things in VR as well. I kind of agree with that philosophy in some ways, so that's what you're hearing when I talk about that spectrum. That said, I don't agree. I think there's stuff in VR. So for instance, if I'm in a world, and if I'm in a video game world, and I'm using something where you build things, or something where you tear things down or whatever, and I am in that video game world and my effective reach is to that chair in the back of the room, it doesn't really mean anything in terms of physical space. When I'm in VR and my reach is to that chair in the back of the room, that does have a specific meaning. And now the fact that I can reach that chair when my arms are clearly not that long, that's a compelling new interaction. And yes, in some sense, it's an extension of something that I can conceptually grasp, but my ability to, with a wave of a hand, open this box up and look inside of the electronics inside of it, those are things we can understand in terms of physical metaphor, but they aren't things we can actually do. So I think there are the same kinds of new interactions for VR compared to AR. I just think that the ones we see with AR don't always map onto physical metaphors that we already have and we understand. And to me, that again goes back to the whole notion of what's really interesting about VR is it's like the kind of thing you would have imagined as a kid. It's completely conceptually, it makes perfect sense. People grasp it. Most people grasp it right off the bat when you explain it, because they get the idea of creating an virtual reality around them. I don't want to say artificial reality because that gets the AR VR thing very confusing. So I think that there are actually unique interactions for both.
Okay, so we are out of time, but we are not out of questions, which I don't think is a bad thing. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today and participating in the discussion. Feel free to chat with me or Travis or among yourselves about this problem, and hopefully next year we'll see more of a VR track at the GER Summit. Thanks.
Thanks.